everybody's day been? Oh, there you go. I can hear the sound. Now, if we can just get this little sucker. There we go. The first one, it's not the fanciest graphic in the world anyway. The first graphic that you missed was called The American Campus Under Siege. This was a trend that you're all noticing in higher education today. It's not just Charlottesville, unfortunately. What we're seeing in the country is an incredible rise of incidents on campuses. That's because a lot of organizations have figured out that campuses are very good places to make a statement. And a lot of organizations are seeking out campuses and very successfully using them as examples of liberal bias. And it's really been a troubling set of issues on campuses. The other thing we've seen over the past, since the November election actually, has been that incidences of white supremacist propaganda on campuses, these leafleting, these really ugly kind of posters, those incidents have tripled in the year since the 2016 election. The other thing that's happening on campuses is some of it's political. There's also, as you all heard this past year in the tax bill, they enacted this tax on endowments. This affects only maybe the richest endowments in the country, but it all fits kind of a broader pattern, we think, of just where the American campus used to be seen as this sort of symbol of good and is now clearly a place that is being attacked politically. It's being attacked by organizations and groups like that. Trend number 2, now I've caught up. It's this trend, it's this notion of students in charge. Well, I mean, obviously the students are not in charge, but what's happening, and obviously the other thing to point out is it's not all students who are in charge, because really there are a lot of students who are still very much disenfranchised students at community colleges, students at the regional colleges that don't really have this kind of clout. But what we're seeing at a lot of other institutions, in part because the funding formulas have changed, student tuition is making up a bigger piece of the pie, and also that's at state universities, and obviously tuition-dependent institutions are very interested in making sure that the students who are coming and paying tuition are very happy. And so we're starting to see the balance of power shifting a little bit on college campuses. And you're seeing that reflected clearly in the way that some curricula are being changed on campuses, a lot more market demand curricula. You're also obviously seeing it in the amenities, in the nature of amenities on campuses. That's not a new phenomenon, but it's sort of increasing. You're seeing nicer and nicer dining halls, nicer and nicer residence halls, nicer and nicer lazy rivers and climbing walls and the like. And frankly, a focus on career centers, which is also sort of a reflection of both what the students want and frankly what their parents want a little bit too, a little greater attention to this. Loss of global prestige. Well, this is not a surprise to too many of us here. Things like the travel ban, the higher visa scrutiny on students, the efforts, the government's failure to find a solution to DACA have all kind of created a climate in the United States that makes the United States seem much less a popular destination for students from overseas. I think in 2016, 2017, the number of new international students in the United States dropped for the first time in a decade. We still have we still are the leaders in international students, but obviously all of you know who run businesses, new customers, new students. That's a trend line that matters, and those new students are dropping. And it's not just the political environment that we have in the United States, it's sort of coupled with other effects. There's, many of you may know, there have been big scholarship programs in Brazil and Saudi Arabia, and those governments have cut those out in the last year, and that's resulted in a 14% decline in Saudi Arabian students in the past year, and a 32% decline in Brazilian students. Obviously, that's not as wealthy a country, and if those students are not getting supported by their government, they're not coming. And this doesn't happen in a vacuum. The impact of what's happening in the United States is affected by what's happening overseas, and guess what? The UK, Australia, and New Zealand are all making really big pushes to go after the international market that the United States seems to be turning its back on. Peer review and Flux. A lot of you, this is not necessarily an area that a lot of you deal with day in and day out. It seems like more of a scholarly issue, but it's actually reflected in many of the same trends that you're all dealing with in your jobs. Journals are not just really keeping up with the pace of scientific discovery. And so the whole peer review, that's sort of having a big impact on the scholarly enterprise of higher education. And frankly, there's another thing happening that you all are feeling in your world that we're seeing in the higher ed establishment. There's this ethos of open sharing and open information, but that doesn't really match up with the business models of scholarly publishing organizations. And scholarly publishing is sort of built around this model of peer review. So what we have is sort of a clash of culture in the scholarly press world and in the scholarship publishing world. it may not sound like a day-to-day problem that you have to think about, but just think long-term. Scholarly publishing is the basis for the fundamental findings that sort of shape our society. It's how we develop new research. And so until we kind of get this peer-reviewed scholarly picture sort of back in balance, it's going to create some challenges for us. The era of deregulation. You've all been seeing a little bit of this. It's also, again, not a surprise, but if you've been paying attention a little bit in Washington, what you know is the Trump administration under Secretary DeVos has been making some changes in a lot of the regulations that we thought were in some cases settled regulations, certainly controversial ones, but ones that are out there. There have been new discussions about the rules like the gainful employment regulation that affects how career programs are governed at colleges. There's been a rollback in how the government oversees Title IX regulations and Title IX enforcement. There's been a general rollback in consumer protections for students who are student borrowers. There's been a change in the philosophy at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There's now a person in charge of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau who actually doesn't believe the bureau should exist. And so the kind of protections that bureau has been putting around are not really in the mix, are being rolled back quite a bit. And even in areas like distance education, where the federal government had been implementing some regulations, many of them also controversial, there's now some talk that even some of those regulations are going to be rolled back. So these are regulations people didn't necessarily like, so you might welcome them, but they've also been regulations that people have kind of adopted to and have been dealing with and working with and kind of finding their own way around for the last 4 or 5 years, and now suddenly that might be rolled back. And the consequences of this are not, you might say, oh, great, it's all going to be over. It's not going to be over. It's not going to be clear. We're still going to have state attorney generals in many cases resisting some of these changes. We're certainly going to have consumer groups resisting some of these changes. So when you roll back regulation, and especially in an environment where we've been so far, it doesn't just go away. There's still going to be a lot of litigious activity around this sort of change in philosophy. At the same time, I mean, some of these rollbacks and regulations and the philosophy behind rollbacks might be beneficial for some of the people in this room. I think you can expect to see some changes in how Pell Grants are allowed to be used as the higher education, as this philosophy influences the next Higher Education Act. There'll be a lot more flexibility on that. So there is a little bit of a give and take, but I think there's a lot of people in the consumer protection world who look at this deregulation very nervously, and I think it's going to be an issue that's going to just sort of continue to be sort of an undercurrent undercurrent of higher ed. Student success up front. We've been hearing a lot about that at this conference, but it's also not going away. And this is not just about adaptive software platforms and things like that, or even about hiring success coaches. What we're starting to see is really a systemic approach to student success in higher education that looks very different than what we saw even a few years ago. Perhaps the best example of this, and I realize people have heard a little bit about Georgia State, possibly even at this conference, but a little bit of a version of that is the completion grants that Georgia State is offering. They're thinking about this in a systemic way, and they're saying they can use data to identify students who are pretty close to graduating, and then at the end of the day, they say, let's make sure these students don't drop out. Let's get them a small completion grant as they're near the finish line so they can make sure they can get there. Obviously, Georgia State isn't the only place that's thinking about this. There's a really interesting program at Texas A&M San Antonio. They have a program, it's a 9-week program, it's called Family First. And it's a program that's designed not just for the student, but also for the student's family, obviously. It's almost a separate little curriculum about college and what it means to go to college, all with the eye of keeping the student and the family involved in the process. Data scientists in demand. This is not just a problem in your industry, it's a problem around the country. Data science has been the biggest, fastest growing new graduate degree program in the United States in a generation, according to experts who've seen it. Over the last decade, at least 200 new data science and analytic programs have been added at colleges around the country. Now, that might sound not like a huge amount, but think about how fast higher ed moves generally, and that, I think, sort of reflects an understanding that this is big. Of course, what is data science? Well, as you all know here, data science is kind of a fuzzy term. What does it really mean? In some places, it might mean a computational biology program, a really deep science kind of program. In another institution, it might mean something around business analytics, which might be a little less deep and a little less serious. But nonetheless, I think that the data science ethos has kind of been infused throughout higher education at this point. And it's fascinating. As you know, it doesn't just change what happens in business. It actually changes what happens fundamentally in science. There's this quote that one of my colleagues rooted out from Ed Lazaska, runs the East Science Institute at the University of Washington, where he talked a little bit about the role of an oceanographer. He says, today you cannot be an oceanographer without being a data scientist as well. It's just completely changed as well. It's completely changing the nature of what we do. And that means there's some big challenges for higher education as well. It means higher education is going to need to develop a lot more tools itself for doing this kind of interdisciplinary data science work. And it means higher education is going to have to think in a lot more concerted way about ethics and the issues around data science and make sure that they're developing and helping frame the way these data tools and data materials are being used. And that applies not just in our social media, but also in our educational environments. Rebranding the Ph.D. Ph.D. programs have become too long, too expensive, and they're really still designed for an era that does not exist, this era where there's a tenured faculty professor who's going to have a certain kind of experience teaching in college. And that does not exist anymore. But unfortunately, the programs that takes somebody 6+ years, has them write a book at the end of it as part of their process, and prepares them for a job that doesn't exist, that's not working anymore. So I think there's a lot more discussion in higher education right now about preparing PhD candidates for jobs outside the academy. That used to be really something that was shunned in the discussion in the period, but now it's much more accepted. And I think one of the ways that's being demonstrated is just even in the preparation. Before, what a PhD candidate did for a job was they worked as a TA. They worked for that professor in their class, and that was how you prepared to get your PhD. And some graduate programs right now, they're actually putting they're putting graduate students into internships in museums and in other organizations so they can at least get exposed to other kinds of fields where they might actually work later on as a PhD. I mean, frankly, the problem in the PhD system is still broader than that. They're still producing probably way more PhDs than the academy can handle, and most people who go into for a PhD program still want to be a traditional academic. So there's still a giant mismatch in the mix, but some programs are starting to recognize it a little bit. Black college renaissance. Remember that first thing I said about the academy that colleges under assault and racial incidents? Well, these are not unrelated trends. The more we see sort of hostility to people of color on campuses, the more some people who are students of color are assigned to good institutions where they find things to be a little friendlier. We have seen this year not just record enrollments at a lot of HBCUs, we're also seeing enrollments of Latino students and Asian American students rising at HBCUs. So it's not just a black student going to a historically black college, it's students of many other ethnic and minority groups who are looking to the HBCUs as a place of support. And these colleges are they're a little bit having their day right now. I mean, there's still many of these colleges that are having financial problems, but we're starting to see several of these institutions sort of punch above their weight. Part of it's because of the leadership of some very impressive college presidents. Some of you heard Michael Sorrell speak here earlier today. I mean, Michael Sorrell is obviously he's a dynamic guy. He's very active on Twitter as well. Some of his colleagues are also doing a very good job of marketing themselves using Twitter and other social media. So I would encourage you to follow Michael Sorrell. I would encourage you to follow Makala Abdullah, who's the president of Virginia State. Walter Kimbrough, who's the president of Dillard University. His Twitter handle is Hip Hop Prez, because he calls himself the Hip Hop President. Rosalind Clark Artist, who's the president of Benedict College now, and David Wilson is the president of Morgan State. If you're following these 5 people, you'll get a better feel of the dynamism that's going on right now at HBCUs. Andrew Coffey was 20 years old and was a student at FSU. Matthew Ellis was 20 years old and was a student at Texas State University. Maxwell Groover was 18 and was a student at LSU at Baton Rouge. Timothy Piazza was 19 years old and was a student at Penn State. The very sad thing that all these students have in common is that they all were victims and died of hazing incidents in the past year. Obviously, hazing is not new, but there's a sense by many people who work in higher education right now that the intensity and the implications and the ramifications of hazing has never been greater. And we're starting to see a lot of feeling about that. We're also starting to see some reaction to it, finally. I don't know how ultimately powerful it's going to be, but particularly the parents of Mr. Piazza and Mr. Groover, his parents have been very active in pushing for stricter hazing laws around the country. 10 minutes ago before I came in, I checked the Slack channel for the Chronicle, and I'd seen that in the Pennsylvania House today, they voted a bill to put in stiffer penalties for hazing in the state of Pennsylvania. So I think we're maybe starting to see some reaction to this. We'll see if it lasts. What happens typically with these hazing things is that they're very powerful. There's a lot of reaction, and then people take the eye off the ball and it kind of goes away again, or these things kind of go underground. So those are the trends that were in this Chronicle's 2018 Trends Report, but I'm not satisfied with those. So I thought I'd talk about a few more trends that I'm seeing out there that my colleagues and I are just starting to talk about, and we're have our eye on them this year. One more. Not such a fancy slide, I apologize for that. Some of these are things that we've been hearing a lot about at this conference today that I think are starting to matter quite a bit. OER remaking the textbook market. Or maybe it's a textbook market responding to OER. Or maybe it's the analytics movement that's having an impact on both OER and the textbook market. Whatever it's happening, I don't know where the cycle starts and where it ends, but certainly I think if you don't think that there's going to be a change in how the textbook market works in the next 2 or 3 years, well, you're wrong. There will be a change. It's a major shift that's happening right now. It's been building for a while, but I think the growth of the OER movement right now is actually sort of tipping the balance quite a bit. This is not the most elegant way to write this, social mobility as the new college measuring stick. But how many of you saw the research that came out last year in the New York Times by Rod Schetti and others that talked about which colleges were really putting people ahead at making a difference in people's lives versus not? How many of you were familiar with that? I think you're going to just see a lot more of research around this kind of work, a lot more use of that Rod Schetti data. Actually, if you went to a school that got, I see Ann Kirshner here, she wants to brag about her school. If you're associated with a university that did really well in that, raise your hand also. See, you know it, and you want that to be the new metric. And I think we're going to start to see that as a new metric. As we're talking about ROI, as we're starting to talk about what the value is of higher education, frankly, I think colleges would be wise to use that more frequently as a metric for how they make an impact on students. Organizations like the Washington Monthly have been trying to do this for a lot of years. It's a small component of the US News formula. It's a little bit of a component in the Business Week formulas about salaries, but just this notion of social mobility, I think we're just keep it in the back of your mind, and as you start to read articles lately, see how much more often this kind of comes up as a topic. M&A as a financial strategy. Now, obviously, it's not a great strategy. Usually, when you're doing M&A and you're the A, it's not a good sign that you're not in the control of this picture. To be the acquired is not necessarily, a position of strength. But we're seeing a lot of smaller private colleges, and even not so small private colleges. Mount Ida College in Massachusetts, which just announced it was going to be merging with UMass Boston. That's 1,500 students, so that's not like a little tiny Bible college somewhere. That's a pretty sizable institution with a pretty robust enrollment, unfortunately with a lot of debt. I think you're just going to start to see a lot more discussion about mergers, acquisitions, shared services, a lot more shared degree programs. The financial realities of these things are starting to hit, and obviously influenced by demographic trends, financial trends, and everything else, but certainly it's out there and it's in the environment right now. And the last trend, it's one that's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's the adult student. It's near and dear to my heart because I did a big report on the adult student this year for the Chronicle, but the reason I did the big report on the adult student for the Chronicle is because it's a topic of compelling importance for our country. The subtitle for this is "The Population Colleges and the Nation Can't Afford to Ignore." 80 million adults right now who have some high school or some college but no degree. That's a big piece of the population that the country cannot afford to leave behind. And I think colleges are starting to recognize that. Colleges can't just do this if they see it as just a market. This is not a market. Not every one of these students is like sitting there with pockets of money ready to go to college. If you're looking at this as a moneymaker, if you're a college, that's a mistake. Some of the students can, some can't. But if you think our country can afford to leave these students behind, you're wrong. And then add into that another 15 million students out there with associate's degrees but don't have bachelor's degrees, but maybe have aspirations for careers that require a bachelor's degree. It's 95 million Americans. That's a lot of people in our country right now. a lot of adults in a lot of parts of the country that, in many cases in parts of the country where the economy is not doing that well and where there really needs to be a lot more solutions that will link education and the economy together. So I made it with 1:24 to go. That's the trends. This program is not designed for questions, but I'm going to very quickly have you shout out if you think you have one or two more trends that you think you want me to put on my radar for next year, or if you want to predict whether they're going to show up in the report next year, just shout them out real quick. Nobody's got a trend. Go. Alt-ed, basically. All these people in the room, okay, the alt-ed movement. You think it's going to have a moment in a way that didn't have it before. Okay, anybody else? I'm writing them down. Cheat. I have to go back to the office in a few weeks and say, what's next year's trends? I'm going to use this as my cheat sheet here. Got 40 seconds. Anybody else? Data privacy, excellent. Why did you say that? Oh, never mind, I think I know. 29 seconds. Of which? Rise of centers for teaching and learning. I would say teaching in general, and actually that's you gave me a nice little segue there. The Chronicle has actually been paying a lot more attention ourselves to the notion of teaching and learning. We've got a report that's going to look a little bit like this coming out that talks a lot about the future of learning. We have a weekly newsletter that's free. You don't even have to be a subscriber to the Chronicle, where we talk a lot about the importance of teaching, what people are doing, what works and what doesn't. So I'm not trying to make a commercial out of this, but I guess I'm agreeing with you that it is an area that we've identified also as a place of real importance and real activity on campuses. 15 seconds, anybody else? We'll start a new newsletter all about it. How to scale STEM? How to scale? Yeah, definitely a challenge. The STEM challenge broadly, but if we don't have STEM students in the pipeline, we're certainly not going to have professors to teach the STEM students. Okay, I'll go, and then I'm going to have the red card. Increasing mental health issues. I think that actually was a trend last year in our report, so we didn't want to repeat it this year, but anyway. I got the red card. Thank you all very much for coming.